longing and a spiritual need that needs filled, and maybe converted to Buddhism because we didn't feel like we fit into other spaces, so we maybe tried to explore other faiths. And I know that was certainly my experience. When I was in 6th year, I wrote an essay for a religious studies class that was basically, what's the point of your religion? And then wrote to lots of different people to find out why, because I had this longing that needed to be filled, and it wasn't getting filled, in other ways.
What it means to be autistic or neurodiversity in the communities that you inhabit.
I think it's probably a reflection of generally, I mean, more broadly speaking, there's still a lot of work in society at large to be done around awareness of neurodiversity. And so the Muslim community within that is no different. It's no more advanced on that. So I think that's probably part of it. I think there's, I mean, the approach to neurodiversity, and Krisha, you'll know this from the work that you've done too, right? It can vary from, really quite a bleak outlook to, this is some sort of divine punishment of the parents, even, that this is as a result of something they've done wrong, that their child now has whatever it may be, or it can be seen as, oh, this is black magic, or this is jinn, or some other unseen impact that's happening on a child, all the way through to the other end of the spectrum where it's, oh, these are people who are completely pure, sinless, they are somehow connected to the divine in a way that the rest of us sinners aren't, and to serve those with these from who are neurodiverse are, it is a blessing and an honor to be able to do so. So there's just such a range as well, and what you really want to do is mediate all of that, to be able to not completely romanticize, but not vilify, but to be able to actually authentically and wholesomely, holistically include everyone in the community. But I think Sofia could probably add to that too.
Yeah, I 100% agree with what you're saying there. What comes to my mind is the fact that it's not been a priority to learn, and it's because it's the lack of education and work that I do with Scottish Ethnic Minority Autistics, different communities and different languages, is that the language is not there. The language of neurodiversity is just not there. Understanding the different nervous system, and even understanding trauma or mental health, or how our brains work, all that is just not a priority at all. It's all about do your prayers, do your fasting, be obedient. It's more of those kind of applications of the religion that doesn't really include thinking about the different spectrum of abilities and capabilities and limitations of what every human being has. So it's that, but it's also because one thing I noted what Marion said is that in the space that Marion is in, they said that is a very white space of Western Buddhism, and I noticed that when you said that. Whereas with the Muslim community and one that I work with is they're South Asian, they're brown, so we're too busy actually dealing with racism. That is why our priorities aren't there. The education is not there, because we're in survival mode all this time. But now that we've got more education and we're more integrated from the West, we're trying to get that education in there and thinking that there's more to life beyond just trying to fight racism or survive. We need to do more going into the thriving mode, and doing that is by understanding ourselves and supporting each other and educating ourselves. So our journey is quite far behind, which is why it only took till 2023 for an organisation like Scottish Ethnic Minority Autistics to come into existence, whereas we had autism support and autistic people coming forward as advocates many, many years before that. We were just too busy trying to survive. So that's why I think we're quite far behind in our education and inclusion.
Yeah. Do you want to chip in, Marion?
No, I was just going to say, I am quite curious to see how things are going to evolve, because Buddhism has been getting more prevalent in the local, in the West, in our local areas for quite a while. Whenever it comes to second, third, fourth generation Buddhists, what's that going to look like? Because we haven't quite gotten there yet. that. And I'm curious to see what kind of difference that's going to make. I think we had Aileen put a really, really good comment in that finding people accepting that we're autistic is one thing, even though they don't have a learning disability, which is great. But that doesn't necessarily mean having a space that accommodates and supports us. You know, those are two separate things. You know, the faith itself might be accessible in a lot of ways, but, you know, spaces to practice it that is a different thing entirely. Yeah, and yeah, Aileen just said some people in Sangha might disclose being autistic, but may be nervous about doing it to others. And I think that's a really, really common thing. Like, if you see someone that you're comfortable to disclose to, that's brilliant, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is. And again, what you disclose once isn't necessarily what you're going to be happy disclosing to another person or to another one. And you're not going to disclose everything all at the same time, you know? So I think that coming out as autistic in a space that's a different conversation again, isn't it?
Completely. And actually it goes on really well onto our next panel question. And I wondered if I could start with you, Marion, then Sofia Farzana, then Sofia Rehman. What does autistic faith look like from your perspective, including any joys and barriers you face?
I think faith for me is a really private affair. I'm the only Buddhist person in my family. I grew up with a Glaswegian West Coast Irish Catholic family, and actually became disowned by my grandmother whenever I converted, which was a really difficult kind of time, because, you know, I grew up with one religion, and just because I didn't follow it anymore, it didn't mean that I wasn't still part of the family. It didn't mean that I still didn't belong, you know, and that was a really difficult kind of thing. So I always find it quite difficult to share my faith with other people. After that, I found that quite an emotional thing to be doing, and it made me incredibly vulnerable whenever I did that. When people think about somebody who's Buddhist, they don't necessarily think about me, right? I'm not the first image that comes into their head. So it's something that would be quite easy to mask and just not share. So as happy as I am with my faith, it's not always been something that I've shared quite widely, because when I have shared it, it's not always gone well. And there's been that, you know, discrimination within familial circles, never mind anywhere else. When I was younger, whenever I first converted, I did take part in groups, and I really, really enjoyed doing that. But as somebody who now has a really busy job and a teenager and a husband and physical health issues, as well as being autistic, I sometimes find it difficult to actually get consistency to practice. So actually finding a group that I know that I'm going to be well enough to go to, that's not going to conflict with my business, and it's not going to conflict with my family obligations or anything like that. I'm finding that really, really difficult. And I know that if I was to start going to one, I would want to make it every single time, because, you know, my autistic need for consistency, I would need that quite a lot. Whereas I don't think I can commit to that necessarily with some of the other things that I have happening, you know, if I have to travel for work, that kind of thing. So that makes it really kind of difficult. So I tend to ebb and flow in my own practices, you know, so I always live considering the Eightfold Path. My meditation practice can be really strong 1 year, but then I can have a burnout period where it can then be difficult. So for anyone who hasn't meditated, my experience of it is like a really beautiful monotropic flow state. But if I'm burnt out and I'm experiencing monotropic split, then getting into that flow state to meditate can be incredibly difficult. Yeah. So when that's the case, I'll try and think of things that I can do that might be a little bit easier. So meditative walks, for example, meditative cooking, writing in a meditative state as much as I can. So try and get those kind of practices in instead. But I think it doesn't really matter, you know, how much I meditate or how much I read the sutras. I'm always Buddhist, you know, so that might change, that might flow, but I'm always trying to be mindful. I'm always trying to cultivate metta or loving kindness. And I'm always trying to think about what's the impact of my actions on other people. But I do think the older I get, the more I'm looking forward to dedicating more time to my faith. And I'm also aware that we've got Bodhi Day coming up on December the 8th. So I'm trying to think of ways that I can encourage my wee family to participate in that as well. And I haven't even spoke about any of the joys yet, but I've spoken for a while. Do you want me to come back to that later?
That might be good, yeah.
Then I'll just start with joys then. Yeah. There's a couple of things there with I'm very, very thankful that I am Muslim and autistic at the same time. And I think that how I interpret my faith is very black and white, which kind of sometimes gets me into trouble. Because there's other people, typical Muslim people who see things very grey and like, no, it's all right, okay. And I'm like, no, but these are the rules. Why are you not following them? It's haram, end of. And it's something that, like harmful haram. And I'm like, no, but that's it. And I get told off. I was like, no, that you come across as being rude or judgmental, but I'm not being judgmental. I'm the least judgmental person ever. But because I'm like, here's the rules, why are we not applying them? I'm not judging other people because they might get a wee bit iffy about it. But for me, it's a very clear cut, like what's haram, what's allowed, what's not allowed, and the reasons behind it, because I need to know the reasons behind everything, the logic behind it. And because I understand it, I'm much more loyal to those rules because I understand the meanings behind them. I like it's quite funny because I'm with the whole ADHD and being autistic at the same time is such a paradox, because then you've got your prayers and the structure of your prayers. You also have executive dysfunction. You also have time blindness. You also have your sensory. And it's a good and a bad. And I do like winter. It's like you do your wudu once in the morning and actually done like 3-4 prayers, because like I always forget to go to the toilet anyway, so it's all right. So like winter is kind of easy in that sense, where you just do your wudu, the ablution for your prayers just once, and that's easy peasy. When it comes to summer, the long days, it's that extra barriers of, okay, now I need to go wash before I do my prayers each and every time. And it's that, and I've spoken to a lot of people, autistic people online, who say that is like a barrier to going off to do your prayers. Which is quite easy for winter time. But as also when you've got the disruption, when you're talking about monotropic flow or just the whole flow state and the transition period. So I'm good for 3 weeks and then my period comes. And then I say, okay, but I'm not praying for 5-7 days. And then I need to go back into that routine again. And it's like off routine, on routine. As a woman, that's really frustrating. So even though I like my routine and I'm stuck to it for 3 weeks, it's like I'm on autopilot and it works. I like frame my day around my prayers. Food time, work time, family, whatever I'm doing, everything goes around my prayer time. But then when I'm not on my prayers, when I am like on my period, sometimes I've gone off and started doing my prayers. I'm standing up for Salah and I'm like, oh no, hold a minute. I'm not supposed to be praying right now. And it's that remembering, because you go to autopilot. And then there's also the joys of fasting. I find it both joyful, but it's also exhausting. I like the community aspect of it. I like the whole, it's more in tune with my nocturnal state. It's Ramadan, because I'm very nocturnal. So it kind of works hand in hand with me, and the fact that I kind of survive without water and food in a normal day anyway. So it's not exactly difficult for me. And other barriers I would say is not the religion in itself, but those who are like in leadership positions and their application of it and not being inclusive in their understanding. I think that's what the barriers are. It's not the actual faith in itself. What I really love about being autistic and Muslim is the closeness to nature and justice, the balance. I think those two things go hand in hand as me as a person being an autistic Muslim. Balance and justice is huge. Justice is very huge in Islam, equity and equality. And then so is, and it's very commonly said in autistic spaces, and how much we love nature, water, the woods. So and in the Quran we talk about all this stuff about appreciating nature, and it's good for our mental health. It just goes hand in hand.
I'll jump in now, but I do feel like a little bit of a fraudster. So as a neurotypical Muslim, obviously I can't speak for, the perspective of an autistic person of faith. I can only speak from what I've learned in conversation with autistic Muslims or people who are autistic but not of any faith, and as a mother of neurodivergent children, and really in just reflecting on some of the Islamic concepts of diversity and dignity. And so what strikes me is that, in this global community of, what are we now, 2.8 billion Muslims in the world, there's still an expectation of uniformity. So I really appreciated Sofia's earlier intervention on the British Muslim community, which is, often in survival mode because of external factors like Islamophobia. But internally as well, there is this great pressure to be uniform in our praxis of Islam. And, we have internal authority and structures of power and institutions, even though we're supposed to be a religion that did away with all of those things. We're not supposed to be a religion of middlemen and hierarchies, but here we are. This is the plight of many religions, where other forms of power intersect with religion, and we end up with these hierarchies. So for Muslims, there's a big pressure to have this uniformity in our praxis, and yet no two Muslim cultures around the world, or regions, or even linguistic communities of Muslims have complete uniformity in their praxis. So there's this tension in claiming uniformity or conformity. It's really challenged by the fact that there is also not a single autistic way of having faith, right? There's a wide range of experiences and practices that may or may not fit comfortably into community expectations. I mean, some of them have been mentioned by Sofia already, the frustration of flow and schedule that many women, for example, when they are on their period and they're not expected to pray, see that as a relief, right? Like, oh, I don't have to wake up at 3 a.m. to pray. Yay, but for many autistic Muslim women, that's a disruption and it's uncomfortable. But the community expectation is that, well, you're not supposed to pray, therefore don't. So for some autistic Muslims, structured ritual can be grounding. For others, you might have sensory or social demands in, spaces of worship that can make participation difficult. There's no one pattern. And that to me really reflects and emphasizes Islam's understanding that faith resides in intention, what we call the niyyah, and in awareness of God, which is what we call taqwa, and not actually in uniformity or even conformity of religious expression. So what the various autistic experiences of Islam can do is ensure that we remain aware as Muslims of the place of diversity in our faith. And I was actually having this conversation with Sofia the other day, and she raised this particular verse in the Quran where God says to us that of his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the diversity of your languages and your colors. Indeed, in that are signs for those of knowledge. And what I find really fascinating in this verse is the word for colors. And I went off to look at this a little bit more closely as a result of our conversation. And the word here for colors, the diversity of your colors, is alwan in Arabic. Which, yes, it does mean colors, but it also means types or sorts. So the verse can be read as a celebration, not only in terms of our cultural or our linguistic or our ethnic diversities, but also in the diversity of ways in which, we embody being, that humans in all of their sorts and types and kinds, in all of their differences, are to be celebrated, but also to be recognized as signs of God, as divine marvels. And that secondly, that diversity in humankind in this verse is preceded by mentions of the heavens and the earth as a standard in the range of diversity of experience and being among humans too. So it can be as different as the heavens and the earth, the night and the day, and all are to be embraced, all are to be celebrated, dignified, and included. So I guess when I think about, you know, autistic faith, I don't see a singular thing called, you know, autistic Muslim or autistic Islam. Instead, I see a plurality of ways that autistic Muslims relate to God, to ritual, to community. Sometimes that finds resonance, you know, sort of in the predictability of prayer. And sometimes experiences strain, you know, in sensory or social aspects of collective worship or otherwise, right? So Sofia mentioned, you know, the ablution, and that was something that I hadn't realized until it came up in a conversation between Sofia and I. And when I took this back to my little community of autistic Muslims that I speak with, and I raised the issue of wudu, of ablution, and I really, you know, every one of them said, yeah, struggle with that. But it's not something that's ever made space for to be discussed. So, but this multiplicity, you know, it resists that sort of easy categorization. And I think that's what's important. You know, I see a set of experiences that really push us to ask, how broad is our imagination of what sincere worship looks like? And how might Islamic theology's emphasis on rahmah, the idea of mercy, and taqwa, the consciousness of God, how do they help us to affirm those differences without reducing them to tokenism? So that's what I would say on that. I did want to talk about joy as well, but I talked too long.
I was going to say that a lot of what you're saying around the plurality of there what isn't one type of kind of autistic Muslim is something that from the work in my doctoral research, when I spoke to autistic Muslims, very strongly came out that there isn't one type of way to be. There's lots of different ways that people might be and believe. And I almost wondered, Marion, if you wanted to share more about your joys, because I know you were unable to share about some joys you wanted to hand over to Sofia, which is fine, but also if reflecting on some of what both Sofias have said, if there's this uniformity of practice within Buddhist spaces you've been in, or is it quite distinctly different?
I mean, whenever you look at it across the world, Buddhist practice is very different in different places. So some of them have very much an emphasis on meditation, some more on reading texts in different ways, which is why I think, you know, as quite a secular Buddhist, I think it's finding the right space that feels right for you. So if you find a temple, if you find a sangha that practices in a similar way that you do, I think that it's good that we have all these different options that you can go and explore, because there's so many different ways to express faith. It would be dreadfully dull if we all practiced in exactly the same way, wouldn't it? But, you know, I will say there was joy when my grandmother and I reconciled, because that did happen after a year. It took a while. Not sure she ever fully forgave me, but we did reconcile. We were very close. I found this lovely quote whenever I was sort of, you know, prepping for this panel today. It was like, thousands of candles can be lighted from a single candle, and the life of that candle will not be shortened. Happiness never decreases by being shared. And to me, that's such an autistic thing as well. We've got this lovely info dump session coming up for Autistic Pride Aberdeen really soon. And it'll be lots of people coming along and just sharing their joy with each other. And then we will just feel joyful whenever they do that. And I think that that's just one of the nicest, most lovely experiences is getting to hear about people's experiences and feel that joy and share them. Like Sofia and I talk about faith all the time together. We have completely different faiths, but I feel so excited when I hear you talk about yours because you're so passionate about it. The other thing that I think that is really joyful, I could go on about it all the time, but I'm going to stick with one other thing that I think is really joyful, is our connection to each other, the way that we look at it. So in Buddhism, there's not any sense of I, not any sense of self. Like one of my old Buddhist teachers described it as like a great big ball of wool. So what you have at the beginning is still the same ball of wool, still the same bit of thread at the end, but it's not the same. It's changed, it's morphed, it's woven. It's from, you know, maybe from a different sheep even, but it's all attached and it's all connected. But you take that one bit of wool, that one ball of wool, and you put it into something much wider, like a community, like a rug or a carpet, and all these strands get so interconnected with each other, and that's the world. That's us all together in our little ecology. And whenever you tug on one bit, one small part, you see the ripples of that going out absolutely everywhere. And I think that's one of the things in Buddhism that really does bring me an awful lot of joy, because I'm not alone. I'm connected with everything and everyone everywhere whenever you think about it like that. And I think that that's just a stunningly beautiful way to look at your life. I don't feel disconnected from other people because I know that everything that's happening, the trees changing colour and the leaves dropping, the little squirrel that I see whenever I go out on a walk sometimes, you know, all of it is connected because of the way that our lives are all woven in together. And I think that, again, for people who can be very isolated at times and disenfranchised, I think that's just a really beautiful way. I could go on about lots of other autistic joy things, but you'd be here all day. So I'll maybe stop at that one.
It makes me so joyful that there's so much autistic joy in both Islam and in Buddhism. And I wondered, and we'll start this question with Sofia Rehman and open up to Marion and Sofia Farzana if you'd like to chip in after Sofia's responded. What aspects are the we'll start the question again. What aspects of the divine are highlighted by an autistic perspective?
Yeah, I feel like there are actually so many, in fact, and it's going to be a bit like the joy answer. Like the longer I think about this question, the longer my list will get, but I'll attempt brevity here. So we know that sort of earlier research often just assumed that autistic folk, because of this, you know, so-called mentalizing deficits, were, you know, less inclined towards belief in God. We know all of that is, can I say nonsense now? Can I just say it? I think I can, can't I here?
You can, because I've recently written something which says exactly the same thing.
Great.
So go
ahead. I can cite you as well. We know that there are, you know, of course, lots of newer studies, including yours, Krisha. And more importantly, you know, we don't, you know, before studies, we have the voices of autistic believers, you know, and autistic scholars themselves suggesting the opposite, that autistic folk often have distinctive ways of knowing and relating to the divine, and that these differences don't diminish faith, they broaden our understanding of it. And so in my own research, what I'm trying to focus on, what really fascinates me, is 3 areas where autistic experiences can resonate with Islamic theology. And I don't think just resonate, but can really enrich our understanding of Islamic theology. And those 3 are with regards to God's experience of time, gender, and communication. So regarding time, we know that many autistic folk experience time in non-linear ways, and this sort of echoes the Quranic vision of God as existing beyond time altogether. Of course, sort of this lack of chrononormativity as experienced by autistic folk isn't necessarily going to be the same as, you know, the way that God experiences that. There's going to be distinctions, but I believe that there will also no doubt be insights to be gained. And then the second that I've mentioned is gender, the issue of gender. And many autistic folk, again, do not strictly adhere to the, you know, binary gender constructs that, you know, neurotypical normativity imposes on us. And that also aligns with the Islamic understanding of God as being neither male nor female, but beyond gender. And what often happens, because we have the Arabic language, which is such a deeply gendered language, God is often referred to as huwa, which in Arabic means he. But at the same time, we are told repeatedly in the Quran that God is neither male nor female. We're also told, you know, we have a vast, long scholarly tradition. And within that tradition, we have scholars that have said things like, you know, with this gendered language that we have of Arabic, when referring to God, sometimes we should use the pronoun hiya, she. Ibn Arabi famously said that, or infamously said that. And his argument was so that we don't turn God into a man in our minds, because that's the power of language. If we consistently refer to God as he, we will start to imagine God as a man. And that, of course, then has implications for how we organize our community. If God is made into a man on earth then is made closer to God, and that is problematic. So if we can have a perspective, that offers something genuinely disruptive to that, that is welcome. And then thirdly, there is communication. So limited or non-verbal communication, of course, doesn't equate to a lack of communication, right? Just because somebody isn't verbally iterating something doesn't mean that they are not communicating. So in the Islamic tradition, what I find so interesting is that God officially speaks to us only 3 times, right? We have the Torah, we have the Gospel, and then we have the Quran. And then God is silent. There's just, you know, nothing verbal that comes from God thereafter. But the Quran is, again, very clear. That does not mean that God is not continuing to communicate. The signs of God are everywhere. The verse that I mentioned earlier talks about our diversities as a sign of God's. We're supposed to be taking some sort of communication from that. And all of this is what we would call non-verbal forms that go beyond text. Of God's ways of communicating with us. And I think that that's a really powerful parallel as well. So we know that research also suggests that autistic folk may think about God in less anthropomorphic ways, as an ordering or systemic force. You'll all be familiar with Temple Grandin and their work, and who describes God as an ordering force that is in everything, which again resonates really beautifully with Islamic notions of divine order and what we call tanzih, you know, which is God's incomparability. So for me, as I said at the beginning of this, you know, autistic perspectives can highlight aspects of the divine that Islam already holds dear. And, you know, I've only listed timelessness, transcendence, communication beyond words, but there are so many more that there could be. But that our sort of neurotypical assumptions sometimes obscure or limit. And I like, you know, John Swinton's idea of a theology of belonging, you know, recognizing that these perspectives aren't just intellectually valuable. It's also a way of making sure that autistic Muslims are fully seen and valued within the Muslim community as well. Because, of course, the notion of ummah, the community, is really important in Islam too.
Definitely. Sofia or Mariam, do you have any thoughts you'd like to add? Maybe starting with Sofia?
So some of the things I think I already talked about the justice and importance of nature, diversity and logic. But another thing I just remembered was al-mizan, the balance. I think for me, that's really important, because I realise that I'm dysregulated when my balance is off, my emotional disbalance. And it means I'm very sensitive to balance, very sensitive to balance. The change in the time, the change in the seasons, changing my own internal clock, the fairness, when people are not understanding, it's that I'm very, very, very sensitive to balance or lack of. And I feel like al-mizan is a concept in Islam as well that is very, very important about keeping things balanced. And Allah Ta'ala is, you know, the whole notion of balance and equity and justice. So I think that really does speak to me quite a lot. I talk about that a lot more when I'm reflecting on myself being autistic and Muslim. Yeah.
I think this is where Buddhism is kind of different, because we don't have a single entity that we worship. You know, we have multiple beings and lots of different teachings, and lots of, we call them realms of samsara, realms of existence. And some people do identify more with one bodhisattva than others. So, you know, and some people might engage with some different stories than others. But we often talk about, you know, non-duality in Buddhism. So, you know, the physical and the spiritual for us aren't separate. It's you know, because of that interconnectivity. So if everything's interconnected, then everything's divine, you know, and it's all just as important. And many Buddhists sort of see all forms of life as being, you know, just as sacred as any other. So any other sentient being has just as much right to live here on this earth as I do, which is why we find so many Buddhist people who are vegetarian. Not every Buddhist is vegetarian, but a lot of Buddhists are vegetarian because of that innate respect for every sentient being. And I think for us, it's about using our own practice to develop our understanding of the nature of reality and reflecting on our own experiences. It's about our own personal growth and like I said earlier, being our own change in the world, if that makes sense.
That very much does make sense. And I wonder, almost as a means to try to sum up our conversation, because we've got about just over 10 minutes left, what do you want the audience here today and anyone else who might catch up with this session if it's being recorded, what do you want them to know about autistic experience, what it means to be autistic, autism, and your religion or faith? And I wonder if we do Sofia, Marion, and then so Sofia Farzana, Marion, then Sofia Rehman. I nearly said Sofia, which would have been not helpful at all.
I want to start with pointing out what we said before about the lack of understanding or learning and the irony of it, because Islam has a huge focus on education and learning. And what came to my mind as you were speaking here is the fact that the first word revealed was ikra, meaning read, and it was revealed to somebody who we all know was illiterate. So if you don't know something, that's not an excuse not to know. It's like, go learn, educate yourself, and the importance of not knowing something and then taking action on it. That's not an excuse. If you don't know about autism, you don't know about sensory differences or how to include somebody in your community spaces, you go and you learn from credible sources. So even that dignity of learning and understanding, like, how do you do that in the correct way? It's credible sources from places where you can enact change, but also understand that there's authority in what you're saying. So a lot of times we're always listening to people talking about autism who are not autistic, who actually then cause a lot of harm to us. So it's that notion there is, if you don't know something, that's fair enough. Go learn from the right places as well. Regarding the whole understanding autistic experiences, it's about being responsive and reflective more than anything else. You don't need to have a degree or to understand what autism is. You don't have to be the specialist in the room. All you need to do sometimes is just be responsive, non-judgmental, and believe the other person what they're saying. That's it. Put that your limited understanding to one side and come to people, or let people come to you with an open mind and receptive. And that's probably the basic ingredient if I'm talking about people who have no clue about what autism is or what ADHD and neurodiversity is. This is a very good starting point. It just come with an open mind, listen, believe us, and adapt to include us.
Yeah, I think I would very much echo what Sofia is saying as well, that increasing accessibility. There are so many of us out there, like Sofia and myself, whose jobs are literally to increase accessibility around other spaces. So if there is anyone who is thinking that they would like more autistic people to be accessing those spaces, come and speak to autistic advocates, speak to autistic disabled people's organisations, speak to autistic people who practice the faith, and discuss sort of what are the barriers that we're facing, because we all face barriers to practicing our faith at times. So what are those barriers, and work with us to kind of to break them down as much as possible. And yeah, that respect. I had this really interesting experience with a Christian friend whenever I was at university, who was deeply upset because he thought that my eternal soul was damned, basically, and genuinely worried, and it found the concept that you couldn't be a good person unless you believed in a monotheistic religion. That just didn't work for him. My very existence just challenged all of these preconceived ideas that he had, because I was what he considered to be a good, kind, loving, empathetic kind of person, and I think that conversation really made me think about how important it is that we just keep an open mind. And just because somebody doesn't fit your structure, your stereotypical ideas, doesn't mean that they can't still be good in other ways. It doesn't mean that there's only one way to be good, that there's only one way to worship, that there's only one faith that you should be following. Different people all have our own different paths. All religions have got something to offer, and we all grow and change as we practice them too.
Yeah, they are, and I love listening to. I kind of wish I wasn't on the panel so I could just listen. But yeah, I've been echoing what's already been said by both Marion and Sofia, and I think it's just important to remember that autistic experience isn't outside of the faith; it's already part of it. And in the Muslim tradition, we've got, I mean, there's an entire chapter in which the Prophet Muhammad was rebuked by God for turning away from a blind man that was trying to seek counsel from the Prophet. So the story goes that the Prophet Muhammad was trying to speak to the elite of Mecca, but there was a blind man, a poor blind man that was trying to get his attention to speak to him, and was wanting to learn more about Islam. But the Prophet frowned, abasa watawalla, and turned away from him. And that action is the starting of an entire chapter of the Quran. So you have this eternal rebuke of the Prophet made by God for turning away from the blind man in favor of the elite, who don't have this disability. And I think that in that is a really powerful lesson for Muslims. Don't turn away from those who are coming to you and trying to not just learn from you, but to give you an opportunity to learn from their lived experiences. Because without that conversation, without that dialogue, we will be a very, very narrow and therefore harmful community to our own. So I think staying in conversation, recognizing that, the more folk we are in conversation with, the more inclusivity that we have in our conversations, the better and more enriching that is for everyone.
And I'm also just so grateful to have been able to chair, MC, chat with you all as a panel, because I guess what I've found so fascinating is how much overlap between all of you there has been, and also the research I've done in the past with autistic Christians and Muslims, and just how we're really only kind of getting started on an interfaith conversation around what it means to be autistic and neurodivergent within those spaces. So we've finished our questions for the panel today on autism in Islam and Buddhism. We have now a short break. I can't remember exactly how long for, and we'll reconvene at the next time on the schedule. Thank you so much for Sofia Farzana, Sofia Rehman and Marion for your time today, and I look forward to the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.